The control room was silent, save for the constant hum of the monitors. In the dim glow, the screens flickered, casting a strange, unnatural light across the empty office. Outside, the wind howled through the night, rattling the windows, but inside, everything remained eerily still. The ticking of a wall clock was the only other sound, its rhythmic clicking growing louder in the absence of anything else. Jacob sat at his desk, the weight of his eyes heavy from the hours he had spent staring at the same grainy footage. It was his third night on the job, and so far, it had been everything he expected and more. The graveyard shift. The endless hours spent alone in a room full of screens, watching the world go by without ever being part of it. It was lonely. It was boring. But it paid the bills. He leaned forward, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake the exhaustion that had started to creep into his bones. The air in the room felt colder than it should, but he wasn't sure if it was just the night getting to him, or if there was something else, something deeper, at work. The faint flicker of the monitors seemed to match his restless thoughts, as though they too were struggling to stay focused. The office was empty, save for the faint outline of his own reflection in the glass, but even that didn't provide comfort. Jacob wasn't used to being alone in a room full of monitors. Most of the time, he felt like he was more of a guardian than a watcher, guarding the footage rather than watching the world through it. But tonight, as he stared at the ever-changing surveillance footage, something felt different. It began with the flickering. Small, almost imperceptible glitches that appeared and disappeared so quickly, Jacob thought they were just a product of his tired eyes. But then, it happened again. And again. Each time, the flickers seemed to grow more pronounced, more frequent. They weren't normal glitches. This was something else, something that felt off, like a shadow was creeping into the feed. He glanced at the other monitors, his fingers hovering over the controls. There were dozens of camera feeds, each showing a different part of the building. The lobby, the hallways, the elevators, the stairwells, the janitor's closet. But nothing seemed to explain the unsettling feeling creeping over him. Then, it appeared. At first, it was a blur, a dark figure in the corner of the screen, barely noticeable amid the static. Jacob froze, staring at the blurry shape, his heart racing. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was just another glitch. But when he opened them again, the figure was still there. It was faint at first, a mere shadow that didn't belong. But it was growing, slowly becoming more defined. The longer Jacob stared at it, the more it seemed to shift, moving across the screen in unnatural ways. The shape didn't move like a person. It was jerky, disjointed, as though it didn't belong to this world. His stomach tightened, a sense of dread pooling in his chest. Jacob sat back in his chair, his hand trembling as he reached for the control panel. He clicked through the other monitors, searching for the same figure in the other rooms, but there was nothing. Only empty hallways and the occasional flicker of a light in the distance. He looked back at the monitor, the shadow still lingering in the corner of the frame. It wasn't moving the way it should. The way something alive should. His pulse quickened as he leaned in, studying the figure. It seemed to grow larger, shifting in and out of focus. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind him, watching him through the glass. But there was no one. The room was empty. With a deep breath, Jacob tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the cameras were malfunctioning. He quickly toggled through the settings, adjusting the feed, but the shadow remained. His fingers moved quickly now, his mind racing. He checked the building's security system. The alarms were all inactive. The doors were locked. Everything was as it should be. But the figure, the shadow, was still there, looming in the corner of the frame. For a moment, Jacob considered calling someone, anyone. But what would he say? What if it was nothing? What if it was just a trick of the light? He had only just started here, and he didn't want to seem paranoid. But as the minutes passed, the figure remained, never leaving, just hanging in the corner like it was waiting for something. His breath came in shallow bursts as his mind spiraled. What if it wasn't a glitch? What if it was something else? His fingers were slick with sweat as he clicked through to another camera. This one showed the building's main entrance. There was no one there, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he flicked through more feeds, he realized something else. The shadow, If it was a shadow, wasn't confined to just one camera. It was moving, shifting between cameras, crossing from one feed to the next, as though it were following him. Jacob's skin prickled with cold dread. It was impossible. There was no way the same figure could move between the cameras like that, not without being detected by the motion sensors. But there it was, on the screen. The same figure, just a little bit closer this time. His eyes darted from monitor to monitor, trying to find some explanation. But there was no explanation. Not a single person was in the building. He was alone. A sudden flash of static broke through the silence. Jacob jerked back in his chair, his heart racing as the screen went black for a moment, before flickering back on. And when it did, the figure was gone. Jacob let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, relief flooding through him. It was just a glitch. It had to be. But then, his eyes caught something else. A faint movement in the background. Barely visible, but there nonetheless. A dark shape, standing motionless just outside the frame. His throat went dry. The figure hadn't disappeared. It had only moved closer. He scrambled to adjust the camera angle, his hands shaking. He needed to see it clearly. He needed to understand what was happening. But before he could do anything, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. A sense of helplessness washed over him. Jacob stood up, his legs unsteady, his mind spinning. He checked the door. It was locked, as it always was. The hallway outside was empty, just like it should be. But the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was coming for him. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't understand it. But the thing that had been watching him from the monitors wasn't just a glitch. It was real. And it was getting closer. The storm outside had intensified, its roar now a constant, deafening presence in the distance. The windows rattled under the force of the wind, and every now and then, a sharp flash of lightning illuminated the office, casting eerie shadows across the room. The only source of light inside was the pale glow of the security monitors, their cold, lifeless faces staring back at Jacob like 1,000 eyes. He was alone, as usual, the flicker of the screens the only sign that anything was moving in the building. Jacob had spent hours at his desk, watching the monitors, adjusting the feeds, and listening to the occasional creak of the building settling in the night. It had become a routine, a monotonous, almost mechanical process. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened during the night shift. The night was always quiet, except for the occasional janitor, the distant hum of machines, and the soft ticking of the clock. But tonight, something felt different. As he sat there, his eyes scanning the grainy footage of the various hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was a sensation he'd grown used to over the past few nights, but tonight, it was stronger, more pronounced. His fingers hovered nervously over the keyboard, and every now and then, his gaze would dart to the door behind him, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was always empty. The silence pressed down on him like a weight. He leaned forward in his chair, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at his insides. The glow from the monitors was steady, but it didn't offer the comfort he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it made the room feel smaller, as if the shadows around him were closing in. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize the strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. But then, it happened again. A flicker. It was barely noticeable at first, just a tiny glitch on the screen. Jacob's eyes darted to the monitor, his heart skipping a beat. The shadow was back. The same shadow that had haunted him the previous night. This time, it was more distinct, more defined. He could see it moving, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't like a person walking, though. It was off. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't make sense. The shadow didn't follow the natural rules of movement. It seemed to shift in ways that no human figure could. Jacob leaned in closer, his eyes locked on the screen. The figure moved across the frame, but it didn't walk like a person. It glided, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to defy logic. It stopped at the far end of the hallway, right in the corner of the feed. The camera angle didn't change, but somehow, the shadow seemed to stretch, expanding like it was reaching out of the frame. It was almost as if the shadow was aware of him, aware of his gaze. His breath caught in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and an icy chill crept down his spine. This wasn't a glitch. This was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. He quickly switched to the next feed, his fingers trembling on the keyboard. His eyes scanned the hallway, the empty stairwells, the dark corridors. There was nothing. Just the empty building. No sign of the shadow. But the more he looked, the more it felt like the shadow was following him, like it was moving from one camera to the next, staying just out of sight. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The shadow wasn't confined to one camera. It was moving between them. The flickering images on the monitors seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the shadow stretching and shrinking with each feed. It was almost like the shadow was alive and aware. Jacob's mind raced. There was no way this could be happening. The building was empty. He was alone. There were no other staff members on shift tonight. He checked all the feeds before, and nothing unusual had shown up. But now, as he glanced back at the first camera, the shadow was still there. It was closer this time, closer to the center of the frame. It seemed to stretch out of the corner, its shape more distinct. Panic surged through Jacob's chest. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog of fatigue clouding his vision, but the shadow remained. His hands were slick with sweat as he fumbled with the control panel, trying to adjust the angle of the camera, but the shadow wouldn't disappear. It just kept moving. His breathing became shallow as his fingers hovered over the console. What was he supposed to do? What if someone had snuck into the building? He quickly checked the security logs. All the doors were locked. No alarms had been triggered. There was no sign of any entry. Everything was secure. But the shadow, how could it be there if no one else was? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, watching him through the glass. The room was still empty. The silence was deafening. His eyes darted back to the monitor, where the shadow had moved again. This time, it wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was in the corner of the office, standing just outside the camera's frame. His pulse raced, and his breath caught in his throat. The thing that had been haunting the footage was now here, in the room with him. He could feel its presence, pressing against him, suffocating him. Desperation set in. Jacob clicked through the other camera feeds, frantically searching for any sign of life. Nothing. Just empty hallways, silent stairwells, and the flickering lights. But in the corner of each feed, in the dark corners of the building, the shadow remained, just out of sight, waiting. Watching. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, made his blood run cold. It was distant at first, a soft static hiss in the background. He leaned in closer, straining to hear. The noise grew louder, clearer, as though it were coming from the speakers themselves. A voice, low and distorted, whispered through the static. Jacob's heart stopped. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. It was almost as if it was calling his name. Jacob, his name echoed through the room, the voice soft, almost too quiet to make out, but there was no mistaking it. He wasn't imagining things. The voice was real. He quickly ripped off his headphones, his mind racing. The voice was coming from the speakers, right in front of him. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his hands shook uncontrollably. Was someone messing with the system? Had someone hacked into the security system? His mind whirled with possibilities, but none of them made sense. The building was locked down. He was the only one there. The voice came again, louder this time. Jacob, it was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. A demand. His eyes darted to the door, then to the monitors again. The shadow was still there. In the corner. Watching. Waiting. It wasn't just a glitch, it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something else entirely. His mouth was dry, and his stomach twisted with fear. There was no escaping it. The shadow was in the room with him. And it had been there all along. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he sat frozen in the dim glow of the security monitors. Every sound felt amplified, the buzzing hum of the screens, the occasional flicker of static that seemed to carry a whisper in its wake, and the relentless roar of the storm outside. The wind howled against the building's windows, rattling them violently, but it was as if the noise was somehow distant, muffled by the sheer weight of what was happening inside the control room. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching the distorted, jerky movement of the shadow in the camera feed. The figure seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were feeding off his fear. Each flicker of static seemed to draw it closer, and the further Jacob tried to distance himself from it, the more it felt like it was closing in. It wasn't like anything he'd seen before. The movements were erratic, unnatural, too fluid, too jagged all at once. It didn't belong in this world. It couldn't. He looked at the clock, 2:43 a.m. The hours dragged on, but it felt like time had come to a halt. The silence in the room was suffocating. Jacob could feel his pulse in his throat, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was it? What did it want? But most terrifying of all, was it real? The longer he watched, the more the question gnawed at him. His rational mind screamed that it had to be a glitch, a malfunction in the system. But every time the figure moved, he could feel something in his gut telling him it wasn't. It was real. Too real. The chilling sensation of being watched crept over him, his skin prickling with the weight of invisible eyes on his every move. The air in the room was thick now, almost suffocating. Jacob stood up, his knees weak as he stumbled toward the window, pressing his hands against the cool glass. The view outside was swallowed up by the darkness of the storm, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of lightning that briefly illuminated the world outside. He stared into the abyss, hoping the sight of the storm would ground him, make him feel less like he was going mad. But even with his back to the monitors, he couldn't shake the feeling. It was there, in the back of his mind, lurking just below the surface. The shadow. The thing he couldn't explain. The more he tried to reason with himself, the more the doubt crept in. What if I'm just tired? What if I'm seeing things because of the isolation? He had only been working here for a few weeks, but the long hours and the lonely shifts were starting to wear on him. But even in his sleep-deprived state, he couldn't deny the terror that gripped him every time he looked at the feed. He turned back to his desk, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he slowly lowered himself into the chair again. The room seemed to close in around him, the monitors more oppressive now, their glowing faces watching him as much as he watched them. The shadow was still there, only now it was moving in ways that defied all logic. It was no longer confined to the corners of the screen. It was stretching across the hallway in the feed, its shape growing larger, more solid. Jacob leaned forward, his hands shaking as he reached for the control panel. He toggled through the cameras again, jumping from one hallway to another, but the shadow was always there, just out of reach, like a specter following him. No matter where he looked, it was like the darkness was alive, shifting, adapting to the changing angles of the cameras. His mind was starting to break. He could feel it, like his thoughts were slipping away from him, like he was losing grip on reality. Am I imagining this? Am I losing my mind? His gaze flickered to the clock again. 2:58 a.m. He had been sitting there for hours, staring at the same footage, watching the same figure. The longer he watched, the more he began to lose track of what was real and what wasn't. The lines between the two blurred until everything started to feel like a dream, or a nightmare. He rubbed his eyes, hoping to clear the fog of exhaustion, but the image of the shadow only grew sharper. The more he fought against it, the stronger it became, like it was feeding off his fear. Then, without warning, the lights flickered, once, twice, before plunging the room into total darkness. Jacob froze. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of light more oppressive than anything he had ever experienced. His breath caught in his throat, the darkness wrapping around him like a suffocating presence. He reached instinctively for the desk lamp, but when his hand brushed across the surface, he found nothing. The lamp was gone. It was as if the room had been swallowed whole. He stood up, his legs weak and unsteady, panic surging through him. The storm outside raged louder now, the wind's shrill scream piercing the silence. His hands fumbled in the dark, but it was no use. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't even tell where the door was. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had come, the lights flickered back on. But something was different. The shadow had moved. It was no longer confined to the corner of the screen. It had spread across the hallway, filling the entire frame. Jacob's pulse raced as he stared at the monitor, his eyes wide with terror. The shadow, whatever it was, seemed to be growing, expanding, its edges bleeding into the walls, the floor, the the ceiling. It was like it was no longer a mere figure on a screen. It had become part of the building itself. His breath came in shallow bursts. He was no longer sure if he was still watching the footage or if it had somehow bled into his reality. The boundary between the two was gone. His hands shook violently as he reached for the keyboard, his fingers trembling so badly that he could barely hit the keys. He tried to rewind the footage, to get a better look at the shape, but the controls were unresponsive. Every time he tried to make the footage move, the shadow seemed to move faster. It was too much. Jacob slammed his fist against the desk, a cry of frustration escaping his lips. He was trapped in a loop, a cycle of fear that he couldn't break free from. It was like the shadow was alive, hunting him, always one step ahead. He could feel its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. No matter how hard he tried to look away, it was always there, lurking just behind his vision. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the air thick with an almost palpable sense of dread. The temperature in the room had dropped, and he could see his breath misting in the cold air. The storm outside raged harder now, but Jacob couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He had to understand. He had to know what was happening. But then the voice came again. Low. Distorted. A whisper in the static. Jacob, it was as though the voice was crawling out of the speakers themselves, a sound that scratched at his very soul. It was a name he recognized, a name that should have brought comfort. But the voice, it wasn't right. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the building. Jacob's body froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. His heart skipped a beat as the shadow on the screen flickered, then warped into a new shape. The figure on the camera feed was now moving toward him, slowly, relentlessly. It was coming closer, inch by inch, with every passing moment. His breath was ragged as his mind raced. No. This can't be happening. It's just a glitch. It has to be. It's just the storm, the wires, the monitors. But deep down, he knew the truth. The shadow wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. And it was getting closer. He tried to pull himself together, to focus on the task at hand, but the air felt heavier now, suffocating. His vision blurred, and his thoughts became fractured, each one tumbling over the other in an endless spiral of terror. He couldn't escape it. The shadow was coming for him. The room felt colder now, far colder than it had any right to be. Jacob's breath formed visible clouds in the air, a chill creeping into his bones as he stared at the monitors. The air around him felt thick, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, the weight of time dragging him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The flickering of the screens seemed to grow more erratic, as if the monitors themselves were fighting to stay alive in the oppressive darkness that had taken over the control room. He couldn't remember when exactly the voice had started. It had been a whisper at first, something faint in the background, just out of reach, something he thought was his imagination playing tricks on him. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer just a background hum. It was a voice, clear, though distorted, crawling through the static and invading his thoughts. The voice had a rhythm, a cadence that was unsettlingly familiar, but no matter how hard Jacob tried, he couldn't place it. Every time it spoke, a shiver ran down his spine, and his heart would race, pounding in his chest as though it were trying to escape. It was as if the voice knew him, knew his thoughts, knew the deepest fears he had tried to bury. But he couldn't understand why. The voice was coming from the speakers, from somewhere inside the building, but there was no one else here. He was alone. The shadow remained on the screens, a dark, malevolent presence that seemed to pulse with an almost tangible energy. Jacob couldn't tear his eyes away from it. It was as if the figure was pulling him in, drawing him deeper into its world, into its nightmare. It moved in ways that were wrong, unnatural. It slid across the footage like something out of a horror movie, jerky and disjointed, like it wasn't entirely a part of the world it was supposed to inhabit. The way it glided, its shape warping and bending in ways that didn't make sense, felt wrong on a visceral level. It wasn't like any person he'd ever seen. It wasn't even like a shadow. It was something other, something that didn't belong. Jacob shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He had to think. He had to rationalize this, to find a logical explanation. The storm outside had knocked out power earlier. Maybe the electrical fluctuations were causing the cameras to glitch. Maybe the storm was interfering with the signals, distorting the footage. It was all he could grasp onto as his mind began to unravel. But as he toggled through the cameras again, his pulse quickened. The shadow had moved. No longer confined to the corner of one camera, it was stretching across multiple feeds, shifting between them with impossible fluidity. It was like the thing was following him. No, worse, watching him. His mind spun in a circle of disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't prepared for something like this. He was just a security guard, a night shifter. This wasn't supposed to be part of the job. A strange, cold sweat began to bead on his forehead as he reached for the desk lamp. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of the control panel, but when he tried to flick the light on, the bulb sputtered and died, leaving him in total darkness. He jerked back in panic, his pulse spiking. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, darker, like they were creeping toward him, closing in. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder outside. His own breathing sounded unnaturally loud, as though his lungs were fighting for air that was no longer available. The lights flickered again, then finally came back on, but something was different. The shadows in the room weren't just stretching on the walls anymore. They were alive, shifting, moving in a way that defied reason. Jacob's head spun as he turned his eyes back to the screens. The figure, the shadow, was closer now. It was standing right in front of one of the cameras, almost as if it were aware of his presence. He could see its distorted form, still formless, a mass of swirling darkness, yet it had an undeniable weight to it. The kind of presence that made every nerve in his body scream for him to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. It was as if the air itself had turned to stone, pinning him in place. A chill shot through his body as the voice came again, clearer now, louder. "Jacob!" The whisper came through the static, slithering into his ears, sending tendrils of cold dread deep into his chest. His throat constricted, his breath catching in his lungs. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers anymore, it was coming from the room. It was as though it was right next to him, but when he turned, there was no one there. No one except the shadow, now closer than ever. He could almost feel it, like a weight pressing down on him from all directions. The cold, oppressive force of it filled the room, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for the phone on the desk, his fingers barely able to grip the receiver. His mind raced, but no coherent thoughts formed. All he could think about was that voice, the one that knew his name, the one that knew he was here, that knew everything. He pressed the phone to his ear, listening for a dial tone, but the line was dead. Nothing but silence, broken by the distant crackling of static from the speakers. And then, the shadow moved again. This time, it wasn't just moving across the screens, it was inside the room. Jacob's heart stopped. He turned sharply, his eyes darting across the office, but there was nothing. The room was still. No shadow lurking in the corner, no shape moving in the darkness. But the feeling in his chest, the sense that something was wrong, only grew stronger. The monitors flickered once more, the static growing louder, more intense, and when they cleared, the shadow was gone from the screens. But it wasn't gone from his mind. It was still there, as though it had never left. His stomach churned, his skin prickling as the air turned colder still. The building seemed to groan under the weight of the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls felt amplified now, like the very structure of the building was alive, suffocating him in its grip. He looked around, his eyes wild, but there was nothing. No movement. No sound except for his own breathing, harsh and shallow. It was like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Suddenly, the overhead lights blinked out again. The monitors went black, leaving Jacob in total darkness. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. He could feel the presence in the room with him now, closer than ever. His breath came in short gasps as his fingers fumbled blindly for the control panel. He needed to see something, anything, just to prove that he wasn't losing his mind. He slammed his hand down on the power switch, desperate, and the lights flickered back to life. But when they did, everything had changed. The monitors flickered again, and when the feed returned, Jacob's heart dropped into his stomach. The shadow was no longer just a shape in the corner. It was standing directly in front of the camera, staring right back at him. The shape wasn't entirely dark anymore. It had features, sharp, contorted, and vaguely human, but wrong in every way. It had eyes, hollow black pits, but when it stared at him, he felt it in his soul, a cold, deep dread that flooded every inch of his being. He couldn't look away, couldn't move. It was as if the figure was locking him in place, pulling him toward it with an invisible force. "Jacob!" The voice whispered again, louder now, more insistent. It didn't just come from the speakers. It came from all around him, seeping into his very bones, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, scraping and scratching at his mind. He felt the panic surge again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just fear, it was something more primal, more visceral. It was as if his body was trying to escape, trying to run from a danger it could feel but couldn't see. His hands trembled as they reached for the monitor controls again, but he couldn't make them work. His body refused to listen to him. The shadow, the voice, they were real. It was real. The air in the room seemed to pulse with a sickening energy, thick and suffocating, closing in on him, and in the depths of his fear, he finally understood. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a trick. He wasn't going crazy. He had been chosen. And whatever was in the building, whatever had been watching him all this time, was alive. And it wanted him. Jacob's body trembled as he sat frozen in front of the monitors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt smaller now, its walls closing in on him like a trap. Every sound around him seemed magnified, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the sharp ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional crackle from the speakers. His mind raced, but it felt like his thoughts were tangled in knots, each one getting tighter as his panic grew. The shadow had vanished from the monitors, but its presence still lingered in the room like a heavy fog. It wasn't just in the feed anymore. It was here, with him, pressing in from all sides. Jacob could feel it, feel the cold, oppressive weight of it in the very air. It was as if the room itself had become infected with the shadow, as if the building itself had taken on a life of its own and was now conspiring against him. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. He leaned forward, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he grabbed the mouse, his eyes flickering back and forth across the screen. The flickering was getting worse now, more frequent, more intense, as if the monitors were being pulled into some kind of distorted reality. The images on the screens shifted and warped, and for a moment, Jacob thought he saw something moving in the corner of the frame, something dark and indistinct. But when he focused, it was gone, replaced by the static buzz that had become all too familiar. He couldn't think straight. The more he tried to make sense of what was happening, the less he understood. He glanced at the clock, but the time seemed irrelevant now. 3:27 a.m. The hours had become meaningless. All that mattered now was the weight of the darkness around him, the feeling that something was about to reach out from the depths of the building and pull him in. His skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, and he could feel his heart pounding harder in his chest. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind, but the cold sweat on his skin told him that it was no use. He could feel the presence of the shadow still pressing on him. It was as if it was waiting, watching, knowing that the more he resisted, the closer it would get. The air was so thick with tension that it felt almost suffocating, and every time he blinked, it seemed like the darkness grew just a little bit closer. His eyes darted back to the screen, where the static had intensified again. The monitor was filled with a chaotic blur of pixels, the image distorted beyond recognition. He couldn't see the hallway anymore, couldn't see the empty spaces that he had once felt so detached from. All that remained was the overwhelming sensation of dread that seemed to pulse through the very walls. And then, the voice came again. It wasn't a whisper this time. It wasn't just a faint, distant sound. It was clear, louder, closer. Jacob could feel it, deep in his chest, as if the voice was coming from inside his body. The words were garbled, distorted, but unmistakable. "Jacob," it rasped, the voice a low, guttural sound that seemed to scrape at his very soul. The name sounded wrong, twisted, like it was being forced through something that didn't want to speak. He spun around, his breath caught in his throat, but the room was still empty. There was no one behind him. No one watching. But the voice was still there. It was real. Jacob's eyes locked on the monitors again. The shadow had returned. It was no longer just a fleeting distortion on the screen. It was right there, filling the frame, taking shape. The dark figure stood motionless, almost as if it were aware of his gaze, aware of his fear. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It had form, an outline, and yet it remained wrong, so wrong, that it made Jacob's skin crawl just to look at it. The more he stared, the more it seemed to shift and contort, its outline blurring and merging with the darkness around it. His mind raced, trying to find some explanation. It was a trick. It had to be. Maybe the storm outside had caused something in the system. Maybe there was a malfunction, a short in the wiring. He had read about things like this before, strange glitches, visual anomalies that made it seem like something supernatural was happening. But this? This felt different. This felt real. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. He reached for the mouse again, his hands shaking violently as he clicked through the camera feeds. The shadow wasn't confined to just one camera anymore. It was everywhere, shifting between the hallways, crossing through the frames in ways that defied all logic. It wasn't like it was walking. It was floating, gliding across the screen, moving between the cameras with an unnatural fluidity. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The shadow wasn't confined to the cameras. It was in the building. The feeds weren't just showing him what was happening in real time, they were showing him a warped version of reality, one where the shadow could move freely, crossing from camera to camera, always just a step ahead of him. No matter where he looked, it was there, watching, waiting. He tried to steady his breathing, but it was impossible. His chest felt tight, as though the weight of the darkness was pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The sense of dread was overwhelming, a thick cloud of fear that hung over him, suffocating him. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness again. The lights blinked out, and the monitors went black, leaving Jacob in complete, total blackness. His heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. The silence was deafening, the absence of light more oppressive than anything he had ever experienced. He stumbled backward, his hands reaching out blindly for something, anything, so that he could regain his bearings. But there was nothing. No light. No sound. Nothing. For what felt like an eternity, Jacob stood there, his pulse racing, waiting for the lights to come back on. His mind raced with 100 different possibilities. Was this part of the glitch? Was it just a power surge caused by the storm? His thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess, but there was only one thing he knew for sure: he was not alone. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back to life, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. But as they came on, Jacob's stomach dropped. The shadow was right in front of him. It was no longer confined to the screens. It had crossed the line from the digital world into his reality. The figure stood there, its dark form towering before him, its shape now fully realized. It was more than just a silhouette. It had mass, substance, but it was still wrong. Its edges seemed to bleed into the darkness, as though it were part of the building itself, part of the air that pressed in around him. Jacob's body froze. His limbs refused to move, his mind racing with the same thought over and over again: this isn't real. This can't be happening. His breath was shallow, his chest tight with fear. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him, its hollow eyes locked on his, pulling him in. He could feel its gaze, feel it pressing on him from all sides. The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "Jacob!" It was no longer a whisper. It was a command. A demand. It wasn't asking for his attention anymore. It was taking it. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed by fear, locked in place by the presence of the shadow, the thing that shouldn't exist, the thing that had followed him, watched him, waited for him. And then, with a sickening, slow movement, the shadow began to advance. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on Jacob as he stood paralyzed before the shadow. His throat constricted, his chest tight with the overwhelming sense that he was being suffocated. Every instinct within him screamed to run, to break free of the crushing dread that gripped his heart, but his body refused to move. It was as if his very soul was being held in place by an invisible force, preventing him from escaping the horror that loomed in front of him. The shadow, now fully formed, was like something pulled from the darkest corners of his nightmares. Its shape was indistinct, constantly shifting, as though it couldn't decide whether to be human or something else entirely. Its outline was jagged, twisted, and unnaturally large. The air around it seemed to distort, the space warping as if the world itself was struggling to contain this thing that had somehow crossed over from another realm. It stood in front of him, its presence a suffocating weight that threatened to crush the very air from his lungs. Jacob's gaze was fixed on it, and the more he looked, the more it seemed to shift. The figure seemed to move even though it was standing perfectly still. It didn't have a face, not in the way that a person does, but somehow, Jacob could feel it looking at him. There was no expression on the figure, no features, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. The eyes, if you could even call them that, were two dark, hollow pits that absorbed the light around them, making the shadow seem even more unnatural. His heart raced faster now, thudding against his ribs like it was trying to break free. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The longer he stood there, the more the world around him seemed to blur and warp, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The building felt like it was breathing, alive with some dark, ancient force that had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment. Jacob wanted to look away, wanted to break free from the pull of the shadow, but something inside him kept him rooted to the spot, as if the figure was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The voice came again, this time more distinct, more forceful. It was not just a whisper anymore. It was a command. "Jacob, come closer." The voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, like it was in his head, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, an invasive, malevolent force that scraped at his consciousness. The voice didn't sound human. It was guttural, distorted, as if it had been warped and twisted by something ancient and incomprehensible. His breath caught in his throat, and his stomach churned. The air felt thick, heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He tried to speak, but his voice was caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He wanted to scream, to shout, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, paralyzed by the presence of this thing, this shadow, that had appeared from the darkest depths of his fear. The figure moved then. It didn't step forward in the way a person would. No, it shifted, its form elongating, stretching, as if it were flowing through the very fabric of the room. It was no longer just in front of him, it was surrounding him, closing in on all sides. The walls seemed to bend, the shadows creeping closer, and Jacob could feel the cold of the figure pressing against his skin, an icy chill that burned. It was as if the very air was turning against him, suffocating him, closing in on him from every direction. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. It was like something was holding him in place, keeping him tethered to this nightmare. He could hear the pounding of his heart in his ears, a steady, frantic rhythm that drowned out all other sounds. But the voice, was still there, lingering, echoing in his mind. "Jacob." The command was so sharp, so clear now, that it felt like it was tearing through his consciousness, pulling him toward the figure, toward the darkness. He could feel his limbs trembling, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was as if he was being forced to look, forced to acknowledge its existence. The air around him seemed to freeze, time itself stretching and warping with the presence of the shadow. His mind felt like it was being pulled in two directions, one part of him screaming to get away, to run as far as he could, while the other part, the part that had been swallowed by fear, was drawn toward the figure, compelled to obey. And then, the figure spoke. "Jacob, you cannot escape." The words were low, guttural, a rasp that seemed to seep into his bones, shaking him from the inside out. They were not just words, they were a command, an unavoidable truth. There was no escaping this. No running from it. It had him, body and soul, locked in its grip. Jacob felt his knees weaken, his legs giving out beneath him as the full weight of what was happening crushed down on him. He fell to the floor, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. His mind was reeling, spinning in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Was this real? Was he going insane? Was he dreaming? But no, this was no dream. He could feel the cold that radiated from the shadow, the thick, suffocating air, the weight of its presence pressing in from every side. His vision blurred, the edges of the room melting into the shadows that surrounded him. The figures on the walls, the shadows, they seemed to dance and flicker, moving as though alive. His pulse raced, each beat of his heart reverberating through his entire body, drowning out everything else. The walls felt like they were closing in. The floor seemed to shift beneath him, unstable, as though the room itself was no longer solid ground. The shadow was everywhere now. It was all around him, twisting and writhing, creeping along the edges of his vision. It was as if the darkness was consuming everything, leaving him with nothing but fear, nothing but the suffocating presence of the thing that had been waiting for him. Jacob! The voice came again, sharper this time, insistent. It wasn't asking anymore. It was commanding, pulling him in, drawing him closer. The shadow loomed over him, its form shifting, warping, its features impossible to make sense of. It was too dark to be real. Too large. Too unnatural. And yet, it was there, right in front of him, as real as anything he had ever known. The figure moved again, flowing toward him, its shape bending and distorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was as though it existed outside the laws of the physical world, a force of nature unto itself. His breath was shallow now, each inhale feeling more strained than the last. His eyes were wide with terror, unable to blink, unable to look away. The shadow was closing in on him. He could feel it now, its presence suffocating him, pushing the very air from his lungs. His body trembled, his muscles aching from the strain of trying to move, of trying to break free. But there was no escape. Jacob! The voice was in his mind now, drowning out everything else. It was as though it was inside him, clawing at his thoughts, digging into his consciousness. It was everywhere, inside the room, inside his head, inside his soul. Jacob could feel his sanity slipping away, the edges of his mind beginning to unravel as the shadow closed in, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. He was trapped. There was no escape. The shadow had him. Jacob's entire body felt numb as he lay sprawled on the cold floor, every part of him screaming for release. His limbs refused to cooperate, and for a moment, he was sure that the sheer weight of the terror pressing down on him had paralyzed him completely. The shadow towered over him, its presence suffocating, drowning him in an ocean of dark dread. His mind felt as though it were drowning too, the noise of his panicked thoughts blending with the distorted whispers that filled the air. The voice had become more than just a sound. It was like a physical force, tugging at his soul, pulling him into its grasp with every syllable. It wasn't even speaking anymore, it was commanding, like it was speaking directly into the deepest part of his mind. Jacob, it rasped again, louder now, more urgent, as if it was drawing nearer with every passing second. His name, twisted into something unrecognizable, echoed in his ears, each repetition pulling at him, like a rope tightening around his neck. He tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't make a sound. He couldn't lift a finger. The terror inside him was like a tidal wave crashing over him, but there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The room was suffocatingly still, the air thick with the weight of the shadow that loomed over him, filling the space, pressing against his chest, and making every breath feel like it might be his last. The walls, once ordinary, now seemed to pulse and shift, bending in on themselves as though they were alive, reacting to the dark force that filled the room. The faint buzz of the overhead lights was the only sound that dared to break the unnatural silence, but it was barely noticeable under the heavy blanket of fear. Jacob's vision blurred, the edges of the room melting into dark tendrils that seemed to reach out, like they too were trying to consume him. The shadow shifted, its form elongating, stretching toward him, its edges blurring, becoming indistinct, like it was reaching out to wrap around him. His breath quickened, shallow and erratic, as the air grew colder, colder than it had ever been. He felt his body shiver involuntarily, the cold seeping into his very bones. The presence of the shadow seemed to be drawing the warmth from the room, from his body, from everything that he knew to be real. It was like he was no longer part of the world. Like he had slipped into something darker, something beyond comprehension, and he was being consumed by it. In the depths of his mind, there was a fleeting thought, a desperate hope, that this was all just a nightmare, that he would wake up and the terror would be gone. But the cold that gripped him, the weight pressing on his chest, the inability to move, none of it felt like a dream. It was real. Too real. The shadow was real. It was something tangible, something that was here, in the room with him, feeding off his fear, growing stronger as his panic intensified. Jacob. The voice was unmistakable now. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, and it knew him. The voice seemed to crawl under his skin, whispering directly into his ear, making his skin crawl, his heart race even faster. Every word felt like a direct command, like the shadow was forcing him to hear it, to listen. He could feel the presence of the shadow moving closer, could feel the temperature of the room drop even further as it closed the distance between them. He tried to scream, tried to force his body to move, but nothing happened. It was as if he were trapped inside his own skin, as if his body had become a prison, and the more he struggled, the more the walls closed in. The presence around him grew stronger, like the very fabric of the room was being consumed by the shadow, like the walls were collapsing in on him. The darkness was everywhere now, filling the air, pushing him further into the corners of his mind, forcing him to confront something he wasn't ready to understand. The air was thick with dread, pressing in on him, suffocating him. His body shook violently, but not from cold. No, it was from the sheer terror that radiated from the figure looming above him. The shadow had taken on a life of its own, and it was coming for him. No matter where he turned, it was there. Every time he blinked, the shadow had shifted, its form twisting and stretching in ways that were impossible. Its shape was no longer confined to any single form, and its edges bled into the room, like it was eating away at everything around it. Jacob's mind was unraveling, each thought slipping through his fingers like water, but the one thing that stood clear in his mind was that this thing was not a ghost. It wasn't an illusion or some strange malfunction in the building. It was a force, something ancient, something powerful that existed beyond the realm of human understanding. And it wanted him. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just his name. It was something else. "Come closer," it croaked, dragging every word out like it was savoring the terror that gripped Jacob's heart. There was no room for denial, no way out. His legs felt like they were glued to the floor, his muscles locked, his limbs heavy as lead. Even though every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, his body refused to obey. It was as if the shadow had taken control of him, twisted him into something that no longer resembled the man he once was. But still, he couldn't move. Still, he couldn't escape. With every passing moment, the figure seemed to grow more powerful, more alive. Its form flickered between solidity and fluidity, its shape impossible to define. It stretched toward him, elongating with terrifying speed, as if it were feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. Jacob's heart thudded in his chest, each beat like a drum of war, but the rest of the world had become muffled, distant. The room, the walls, the very air felt like it was slipping away from him, leaving him alone with this thing that had come for him. The shadows twisted around him, their edges blurring until he could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. The dark had become alive, and it was swallowing everything in its path. He could feel the cold, biting into his skin like it was seeping through his very veins. He wanted to look away, but his eyes wouldn't move, his gaze locked on the figure in front of him. The shadow was now within him, curling around his soul, tightening its grip on his very being. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. The words were not a question, they were a certainty. Jacob's mind screamed at him to wake up, to make this stop, but there was no escape. There was no waking up. This was no dream. This was real. The shadow wasn't just some manifestation of his fear. It was something tangible. Something alive. And it had him. His body quivered, his hands twitching at his sides, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move. The shadow was too strong, too all-encompassing. It had wrapped itself around him, inescapable, suffocating. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, the very air growing heavy, thick with dread. He felt as if the space itself was shrinking, pulling in tighter, pushing him into the corners of his mind. There was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to hide. It had him. The thought ran through his mind like a mantra, but there was no comfort in it. The shadow was real. It was here. And it wasn't leaving until it had what it wanted. Jacob's eyes, wide and bloodshot from the relentless pressure of fear, seemed to pierce into the shifting blackness that now surrounded him. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, pounding with such force that he thought it might tear through his chest. The shadow, whatever it was, continued to press in on him, wrapping around his senses, curling its intangible form deeper into his soul. It was as if it had become one with the room, one with the very air he breathed. The walls seemed to close in, and the space around him became oppressive, an inescapable void. Every breath he took felt like it was being stolen from him. The air was cold, thick with an unnatural chill, biting through his clothes and sinking deep into his bones. His skin prickled with the sensation of something crawling underneath it, as though the shadow was seeping into him, becoming a part of him. His body wanted to tremble, wanted to break free, but it was as if some invisible force had locked him in place, his legs as heavy as stone, his arms useless by his sides. The voice, now unmistakable, reverberated through his mind. Jacob! It wasn't just the sound anymore. It was a command, a suffocating pressure pushing into his thoughts, twisting and warping them. He tried to block it out, to close himself off, but it was impossible. The words had taken root in his mind, crawling into his consciousness like a parasite, feeding off his terror, feeding off his desperation. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry out for help, but his throat was closed tight, his voice stifled, trapped inside him. Even if he could scream, who would hear him? The building was empty. The halls were deserted. The storm outside had isolated him. He was alone, utterly alone, and the shadow knew it. With every passing moment, the figure seemed to grow larger, its presence more intense. It loomed over him, filling every inch of the room. The air felt alive, thick with an energy that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Jacob could no longer tell where the shadow ended and the room began. It was everywhere. It was all around him. And it was closing in. He tried to turn away, tried to break his gaze, but his body was frozen. The shadow was inside him now, in his mind, in his thoughts, drawing closer with every second, its presence pressing on his consciousness like a weight that threatened to crush him. It was no longer just a figure on the edge of his vision. It was real. It was a force that he couldn't escape. His mind spun, desperate for answers, searching for any explanation that might make sense of the nightmare he was trapped in. Was this some kind of hallucination? Was he losing his mind? But no. This wasn't a trick of the mind. It wasn't a dream. This was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for him. Something that had found him. The shadow shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Jacob thought he saw something, someone, moving within it. The dark mass pulsed and rippled like it was alive, a swirling mass of darkness, but there was something else in it. Something that didn't belong. A flicker of movement, a silhouette, a figure. But it wasn't human. Whatever it was, it had no form, no substance. It was wrong. The shadow was growing more solid, its shape becoming clearer, yet it was still an unnatural presence. The edges seemed to distort and warp, like reality itself was bending around it, struggling to contain the darkness that was pouring through. And then the voice came again. This time, it was a low growl, more animalistic than before, a guttural sound that sent a cold shiver through Jacob's spine. "Jacob, you are mine." The words seeped into his bones, resonating deep within him, like the shadow was claiming him, pulling him into its void, forcing him to accept its reality. Jacob's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The air had become so thick, so dense, it felt as though he was submerged in water. He was drowning in it. The very walls of the room pressed in on him, the darkness wrapping around him like a vice, squeezing, tightening, until there was nothing left but the overwhelming presence of the shadow. He could feel the weight of it, heavy, suffocating. And yet, there was something worse, the feeling of being watched. The feeling that whatever it wasn't just toying with him. It was studying him. It was waiting for something. Panic bubbled up in his throat, but his body refused to respond. He could feel his limbs aching, his body begging for movement, but it was as if he was stuck in a nightmare, unable to break free. His thoughts began to fragment, slipping through his mind like sand through an hourglass, each one growing more distant, more difficult to grasp. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think clearly. The only thing he could comprehend was the shadow, the suffocating blackness that was consuming him. It was a dark tide, and he was caught in its pull, helpless to escape. The lights overhead flickered again, their buzzing growing louder, more frantic, but it wasn't the lights that made his stomach drop. It was the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the sudden pressure in the room. The weight of the air felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on him, pushing him further into the ground. He could feel it in his chest, the sheer force of it, like the very space around him was collapsing inward, leaving him with no room to breathe. The walls felt like they were bending, warping, as if the building itself was being consumed by the shadow, sinking into its depths. And then, as if on cue, the shadows on the walls began to writhe and twist, contorting into shapes that didn't make sense. The darkness seemed to come alive, crawling across the surfaces, growing, spreading like ink in water, until the entire room was filled with it. Jacob's mind screamed, but his body was still frozen. He could feel the temperature drop even further, the chill gnawing at his skin, turning his bones to ice. His breath came in shallow gasps now, his vision narrowing as his body struggled to hold on, to survive. He could feel his sanity slipping away, the weight of fear pressing on his mind like a hammer, breaking it apart piece by piece. And then, for the first time, he saw it, the face. It was barely there at first, a distortion, a flicker of a feature in the swirling darkness, but then it became clearer. Eyes. Hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb all light, all hope, all warmth. They were watching him, studying him, waiting. The figure, the shadow, had no true face, but those eyes, they were everything. They were deep, endless, pulling him in with an intensity that stole his breath, stole his soul. "Jacob, come to me." The voice spoke again, this time full of malice, full of hunger. It was no longer just a command, it was an invitation. The shadow had taken on a life of its own, and it was drawing him in, pulling him toward it, toward that endless black void, toward those eyes that seemed to see him, know him. His chest tightened with terror as the room continued to close in. The air was suffocating. The walls were bending. The darkness was overwhelming, consuming everything in its path. There was no escape. No hope. Just the cold, the suffocating darkness, and the eyes, those eyes, drawing him in. He was drowning, but the water was dark. It was inescapable. It was the shadow, and it was waiting for him to come closer.